Welcome to another live edition of Your Voice, Your Future. I'm your moderator, Armstrong Williams. You may have heard those end-of-time predictions by Christians who have foretold a specific date and time in which Jesus is sure to return. This never fails to amuse me, especially since the Bible states we do not know the specific day or hour of his return. But is predicting Jesus' second coming the same as claiming that we're living in the last days? You know, I've actually noticed various opinions regarding the term the last days amongst Christian circles. The first group claims the last days are already upon us, and they are the ones who seem to anticipate Jesus coming at any moment, and yet there's another group of Christians I've noticed who tend to roll their eyes at such assumptions, claiming that every generation of Christians has said the same. After all, the Bible warns us that in the last days, there will be much suffering, much pain, much chaos, wars, rumors of wars, houses divided, fathers killing sons, sons killing fathers, mothers against daughters. This kind of suffering, destruction has continued, some would say, throughout the centuries. Well, tonight we're going to talk about all that's going on in the Middle East and Ukraine and Russia and the earthquakes and the protests and the people losing their way of life, and we had COVID and the pandemic. We've asked our biblical scholars to join us tonight to put this all in perspective. And my hero, and one of my favorite, is Pastor A.R. Bernard, who founded the Christian Culture Center in New York, and he joins us. Pastor Bernard, this is the question. First of all, are we living in so-called the last days? And what does it mean, living in the last days? And welcome back to the broadcast.
Well, thank you, Armstrong. It's always a pleasure to be with you here. And you raise an important question, because whenever we see turmoil like we're seeing currently, we start to think about the biblical prophetic or eschatological perspective that, you know, society in this period of time is going to come to a close through an Armageddon war and violence. So the question is very important and I think pertinent. Biblically speaking, Armstrong, the day of Pentecost, the text is found in the book of Acts, where the church was born. This particular age was inaugurated by the disciples. And when Peter stood up on the day of Pentecost and preached his message, he said, this is that which was prophesied by the prophet Joel, that in the last days I will pour out my spirit upon all flesh. And he used the term the last days. So the last days, from a biblical perspective, began 2,000 years ago when Jesus, through the church, ushered in a new age, this period between his first advent and his second advent, his second coming. Jesus identified that as time passed towards his return, that there will be certain signs or signs of the times that indicate that we're getting closer and closer to that. Earthquakes and wars and rumors of wars, you know, these things, lawlessness, etc., has existed throughout human history because of human nature. The difference is that the prophetic view, the eschatological view of Jesus, says that when we see these things happening with greater and greater frequency, that signals that there is a birth pain and something new, a new age, is about to be given birth to. So we used to see floods and hurricanes and tornadoes. When we think about natural disasters, they would happen 100 years apart. Now they're happening 20, 30, 10 years apart. So the frequency with which we see these kind of things indicate that just maybe we're further along God's timeline.
You know, it mentions as evil increases upon the land, so will God's spirit. Explain that.
Well, you know, God's response to a wounded, broken humanity was a pathway of reconciliation through the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus Christ. Jesus spoke to his disciples and said that the time would come when he would no longer be on earth in a physical presence, but the Holy Spirit, the universal presence of God, would be here for the purpose of transforming individual lives in order to impact society at large. He gave three things. He said, number one, he will convict the world of sin. And what that means is to convince human society that lawlessness is not the way to a utopian society. The only way to a utopian society is one where God is present and his divine order is respected and followed. The fruit of that is the kind of society that we all long for, one that is abundant, it's filled with peace and righteousness and justice. Relationships between our fellow man are governed by a set of moral standards and moral values. That's what he talked about in terms of what the Holy Spirit's going to be doing. The second thing, the Holy Spirit is going to convince the world of righteousness, which means that in spite of our broken, wounded condition, we have access to a transformed inner life by reconnecting to God. And that's why we see, even in American society, which is a nation that was founded on biblical principles, right? And a certain belief that we are answerable to divine authority, the life and dignity of the human person, all of that was included, even though we had to work through some very bitter and ugly times that stained the history. We still had that moral accountability that forced us to change as a nation. So when we begin to see those things attacked, and people of faith are now being marginalized within our society, it's an attempt to rid us of the very important foundation, the very important and necessary anchor to our souls. Because without an anchor for our soul, which is faith, all right? Without an anchor for our soul, Armstrong, we have nothing to protect us from what we can become when our humanity runs out. When our humanity runs out, we give in to forces of greed, fear, ambition, lust for power, and on and on and on. It's that anchor for our soul, not only the soul of the individual, but the soul of a nation, that protects us from ourselves.
So let me bring some of the questions before our guests join us. You know, how does someone like a Donald Trump resonate in biblical times, where some would say this is a flawed man, but yet those who profess to be Christians and God-fearing rally around him and they support him and they can justify them. And yet there's also this mindset that wants to believe anybody who embraces this liberalism against transgenderism, against same-sex marriages, against all the kinds of things where they say there is no God. They sort of go against those biblical teachings. Reconcile the two, because in the end, God has to forgive us all for our shortcomings, which is our sin.
Well, let's begin with the sovereignty of God. If God is all-powerful, all-knowing, and everywhere present, and we believe that he exercises sovereignty over human history, guiding it in a particular direction without violating our freedom of choice, our human will, then we have to say that even working with that freedom of choice, God ultimately determines, this is biblically stated, that God determines who's in power. He sets up kings, according to Daniel, the prophet. God sets up kings, he removes kings. He positions people in power, he removes them from positions of power. So if we say that Donald Trump is an instrument of God and was in a position of power, then we've got to be consistent with that. And we can't say that just because he lost the the next election after that, that the devil took him out of office. No, either the devil is more powerful or God is more powerful. We've got to be consistent. God works within human will. I sat at the table with Donald Trump because I believed, along with the unofficial advisory council that he gathered, all right, were there for a very specific set of values and an agenda. And the agenda that appealed to me most were two things: religious liberty, which is very important to me and dear to me, and second, an initiative for the urban environment, the urban communities. These are the marginalized individuals in society that I believe don't want a handout. They want a hand up. And I'm all for something like that. So I sat at the table. But the reality is that if a leader's moral compass, if he has one or does not have one, if a leader's judgments are too irrational and unpredictable to me, it's difficult for me to support that. So I had a moral conflict because there was a lack of consistency. So I chose to bow out. The problem that I have in situations like that is when we, as the Church of Jesus Christ, when we as Christian leaders don't make it clear that the reason we support a candidate is not because of their spirituality, because that's in question with Donald Trump to this day, but because they believe that this individual, this leader, is going to be supportive of and promote their values, the things that are most important to them. I think that if the evangelical community who rallied around Donald Trump had done that in the beginning, instead of trying to sanitize, moralize him, or make him born again, and simply said, look, this man will fight for the things that we value, things that we're concerned about, I think it would have been a different scenario than how it played out. And we wouldn't have seen this kind of question about inconsistency and contradictions with his behavior, because his behavior would not have been the issue. It would have been the things that he was willing to champion that they have great concern over.
Rabbi Stuart Weinblatt and Pastor Gregory Seltz will join this conversation with Pastor Bernard when we return. Don't go away. And welcome back to the broadcast as we continue. You know, Pastor, let me continue with you, and then I'm going to have the rabbi and the pastor join us. Why do you think Jews, even today, particularly with what's going on in the world today, I was at the rally in New York, I was at the protests here in Washington, D.C., and just the hatred of Jews. And what else is not often discussed in this conversation is also their hatred of Christianity. Why is that?
Well, Armstrong, Christianity is rooted in Jewish history and Jewish doctrine. So we have a very close relationship with Judaism. And we subscribe to a set of moral values. Religion brings a moral value consensus, which is necessary for peace, for concord, for justice within a society. And those religious standards and those moral standards also are, we have a very specific way of thinking about how society should be organized and the best way to live in it. And that comes into conflict with individuals who would like to function outside of that moral framework. And we call it, freedom. But even freedom, I've heard it said that the greatest threat to freedom is freedom. Even freedom needs boundaries. And we're thinking that freedom means doing whatever we can. So there's a close relationship between Christians and Jews. I publicly and openly express my support of the state of Israel, its right to exist as a nation. I have disagreed with how Israel has handled issues from time to time, whether it's the Palestinians to a degree, whether it's the Ethiopian Jews who are trying to assimilate into Israel. They continue to grow as a nation, as a young nation. But I stand with them. And let me say that with the current conflict, I think that there's a higher moral value, and that is the life and dignity of every human person, no matter what faith, no matter what religion. And the barbarism that we're seeing, the terrorism that we're seeing is unacceptable. And innocent lives have been lost, Palestinian lives, Israeli lives, and we have just lowered ourselves from who we are as human beings and the dignity that we should carry. We need to normalize diplomatic talks. And I don't know how far you want to get into this, but let me pause there.
Rabbi Weinblatt, it is a very nervous time for Jews all over the world, especially when Prime Minister Netanyahu issues a warning about travel and about being safe. And you see what's going on in college universities, and they're having to hide and being attacked. I mean, this is not happening in some third world country. It's happening right here in an advanced nation like the United States. How have these young people on these campuses and throughout these protests become so indoctrinated?
That's a $64,000 question in many respects, Armstrong. What we're seeing is just this outpouring, this outburst of anti-Semitism, which is so virulent. Young people are describing situations where they're afraid to walk on their campus wearing a Jewish star. They're intimidated, they're harassed, they're brutalized, they're attacked physically. My son-in-law happens to be an ear, nose, and throat doctor, and somebody came to see him the other day because somebody punched this person in the face just for walking down the street in New York. So we have reached the kind of situation which we thought would never happen in the streets of America. It is very serious, this unleashing of this hatred, and that has come up to the surface now, which perhaps had been hidden for so long. And it's a tremendous concern to all of us, and it should be a concern, by the way, to others as well. Now, I must tell you that I've had Christian friends who have reached out, even a few people within the Muslim community as well, who are just horrified by what they're seeing. So I think it's something that we as a society, as a country, we have to address, because if the Jewish community is feeling this and not feeling safe, then it's not long before the rest of our freedoms, the rest of our liberties will also be endangered as well.
I saw something on yesterday during the Eagles-Cowboys game. A businessman was in his suite, and he had on the surface of it an American and Israeli flag. And they sent security to lead him out because he was spreading divisiveness. Now, you can hang any kind of flag in the world. Right. That is, you can say it's filled with hatred, but why would you're talking about the National Football League. And I said to myself, is it that level for the National Football League? If I walked in with my American Israeli pin and my flag and I flipped it over the balcony of my suite, I'm going to be escorted out? Yeah. What does that tell us?
If I can jump in here, I always ask people when I speak, I said, when Hitler said, we have to have this final solution, I always say, what was that? Now, surely it was ethnic in one sense, but it was also ideological. Jews and Christians are people of the book. And the book says that God and our faith in God is higher than government. It's higher than, and government and human beings are then molded by the moral structures and the moral reality of the God who created us and redeemed us. And so there comes this point where if you're a secularist and you're a statist, those people are the enemy. They're the enemy because you can say no. And people don't realize that there's a hatred, not just of Jews and Christians, but of God himself.
And let me just tell you something. And I was going to say this. The person that was kicked out of the suite is a powerful Democrat, George Norcos III. Jr., a powerful Democrat.
Yeah.
It's not as if this were a conservative.
Right.
It was a Democrat who was showing his allegiance and solidarity that America and Israel are unified.
Yeah.
He was let out by security. He was humiliated. He's thinking about filing a lawsuit against the NFL and the Philadelphia Eagles.
I don't.
But I just wonder who saw that and said that.
This is crazy.
I'm just trying to understand.
Yeah.
Pastor Bernard, what is offensive about that?
Strong, if I may build upon what the rabbi so eloquently articulated, it's coming out of the character of the culture. A culture is the sum total of its traditions, its attitudes, its customs, its institutions, its language. And traditions are what that culture believes and passes from one generation to another. There were a very clear set of beliefs that founded this nation and continued. But in the process, those things are shifting. I'm a child of the 60s, so we were anti-establishment. We were fighting for change. And now we're all, most of my generation, are all within the system effecting change. So what I'm looking at, Armstrong, is how our beliefs are being influenced and reshaped and reevaluated in a way that our voices, our moral voices, are intentionally being marginalized within the society, which means that what we have to say is so easily dismissed. And I have to look at the educational system, Armstrong, because one of the problems which came out of CRT, which began as a reasonable reevaluation of history through the lens of race, it was taken to the extreme. So what you have now is this idea that we judge all of human history and what's happening in society by who's the oppressed and who's the oppressor. But who decides that? So to say immediately, because the Palestinians are marginalized, oppressed people, Israel is the oppressor. And there are no rules for that, Armstrong. So it creates this kind of problem. And our young people who have rejected organized religion are trying to create a spirituality around these new ideologies. And that's problematic.
I can just jump in. A couple of things I want to say. First of all, it's very possible that the oppressed can be an oppressor. We saw the horror of what was done on October 7th in Israel, and the vicious way in which there was such sadistic acts that were performed. Babies were born and were burned and beheaded and things like that. We talk about the fact you mentioned earlier about the Holocaust, and many people think that the Holocaust really is the manifestation of the absence of God. And I would say that Hamas ideology is the manifestation of the distortion of God's message. To commit these acts and to say, Allah Akbar, that God is great, I cannot imagine a God who would possibly condone these kinds of murderous actions. And so what we are seeing is an absence of the Judeo-Christian beliefs and the foundation upon which our country is founded. And so we need to try and reiterate that. The alliance that's always existed between the United States and Israel with the shared values. There are people who are distorting that and people who are trying to take that away from us for their own particular political reasons. And the good pastor is 100% right when he talks about the threat from the different critical race theory and other things that are happening in society right now.
Yeah, and Rabbi and Armstrong, you know that unfortunately people are using short history. Right. I was awarded a humanitarian award this last week by the New York Board of Rabbis, and addressing a predominantly Jewish audience. I asked the question, I said, someone help me understand why it's wrong for a people who have suffered living under the threat of genocide for over 2,500 years, close to 3,000 years, who have been evicted and relocated and dislocated from every land. What is wrong with them wanting their own homeland where they can live out their faith and their way of life and their unique identity without the threat of genocide? You tell me what's wrong with that.
Thank you for raising that voice.
Don't want to recognize that because they don't know the history. Their history goes back where the colonialism and the decolonization of Europe and the Middle East, they don't know the history, Armstrong.
Well, and if I can jump in too, the narrative, this is what we were talking about before the program started. There's a morality that comes out of a narrative view of life, and then there's a morality that comes out of a biblical, objective truth view of life. And those are you can already see people justifying these horrific acts like October 7th because they have a narrative that says they have the right to do that. Right. And you're saying, no, they don't. There's something deeper than your narrative that is holding you accountable to this. Well, they reject that. And we're dealing with people now who, it's my narrative, your narrative, and our narrative, and then you're going to see what kind of amorality or immorality can ensue.
We're going to take a break and come back here on Your Voice and Your Future. And I know somebody's probably saying, well, who's representing the Palestinians today? The oppressed. Well, we all are. And listen, we invited the imams. We reached out to 2 imams and invited them on this show, and they're not here. And we'll be back. You know, it is without any doubt that morality holds us all together. It gives us the sense of understanding when something is right or when something is wrong. And, I think what was most disappointing in covering these protests is that there was not one sign. And remember, there probably was 500,000 people here over the weekend on Saturday. I will tell you that. There was not one sign condemning Hamas. And even when I raised the question, because I'm not here to take sides with Israel or Hamas, it's the truth. Okay, it's what I embrace and the facts. And when I engage young people, let me tell you something, and these young people are affluent. They're not poor. And some of these young people are Jewish. Oh, let me tell you, they're not just people from Palestine.
Right.
They're Jewish. And then come from very affluent families. And yet when you ask them in their intelligence, why no empathy for what happened to Israel and the Jews on October 7th and the people that died? Well, the U.S. government gives them billions of dollars and support that military. I said, but the government also gives billions of dollars to the Palestinians. Yeah, it's different than how they spend their money. I said, well, how do you think all those rockets are flying out of Hamas? What do you think that money? But they don't even want to even think about the possibility.
Right. If I may.
Yes.
Within the last number of years, there have been billions, between $50 to $500 billion that have been given to Hamas within the last, depending upon how many years you're looking at. And most of that aid has gone into the coffers of individual leaders of Hamas, and also, instead of building schools, instead of building a society and an infrastructure, they chose it to build underground tunnels and to use it to be able to have weapons. In fact, there was an Israeli individual who lived not far from the Gaza border who was doing research in terms of helping to bring water to Gaza and bringing them with pipes. They took the pipes, they cut up the pipes to use them for rockets, and this man, who in fact had given land to the Palestinians to be able to help them, was murdered on October 7th. So one of the things that people don't realize is, what is it that Israel is up against? Recently there was someone who went around on campus and asked, would you support Hamas? People said yes. Well, would you support an organization that does not believe in women's rights? No, I wouldn't support that. Would you support an organization that has no tolerance for people who are gay? I wouldn't support that. And so they said, well, then you can't really be supportive of Hamas. So I think there's ignorance. And I want to share with you an important statement that Golda Meir had once said, the late Prime Minister of Israel. She said there will come a time when we will have peace with the Arabs. And she was speaking in the 1970s. She says, and when that happens, we will forgive them for having killed our sons, but we will never be able to forgive them for making our sons have to kill theirs. Life is so important in Judaism, and we see in terms of the cautious ways in which Israel tries to execute the operation that it's doing by warning people in advance. Hamas doesn't let them leave by trying to tell people what it's going to bomb in advance so that they are able then to protect and trying to save lives as best as they possibly can.
But when they leave, where do they go?
Well, there are areas that they can go to in the south, but Hamas has permitted.
But they've lost so much.
Of course.
They've lost so much.
Because, but at the end of the day, it's Hamas's responsibility. Hamas launched the attack. Hamas has kept the people there, and they've kept them impoverished, and they haven't allowed them to
But
leave.
there's also people within Palestine that works with Israelis' intelligence to give them information. This is part of success. People forget about that. They don't like this way of life. And they also, when they were trying to leave, Hamas was telling them not to leave. And for those that were leaving, they were being gunned down. But what about in these refugee camps where a rocket just out of nowhere just blows them up? What about them? They're trying to escape the same chokehold that the Jews and the Israelis are trying to destroy.
And that's why Israel's trying to liberate Gaza from Hamas. When that happens, I think we'll be able to see a very different reality on the ground. When that happens, that's when we'll be able to have some kind of a reconciliation and peace and things like that. But as long as Hamas controls, which is a totalitarian government, controls the area there, there's no possibility. They have specifically said, by the way, that they, given the opportunity, they will commit another October 7th and that this would just be nothing. It would just be a prelude. They've made it, their charter makes it very clear that their intent is to kill all of the Jews, all of the Israelis, to take over the entire land. And by the way, Christians are next.
But they're also willing to kill Palestinians.
Absolutely.
They have no need for them. They're just human shields for them. They don't care about them either. While they may carry the posters and the signs, they must fake people to make people believe that they care about the people in Palestine. But Pastor, they don't.
Right, and let's not forget about those who are being held.
Pastor, I'm not hearing you for some reason.
Kidnapped against their will.
I don't know why you're not.
Okay, go ahead. Yeah, go ahead.
Okay. I was just going to say that not only ignorance of history, but ignorance of the dynamics amongst the Palestinians. The Palestinians are not monolithic.
That's right.
They have been influenced by several ideologies with regard to how to structure their society. You have Fatah, you have Hamas, you have Islamic Jihad, you have the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, you have the Democratic Front for the Liberation of Palestine, the Palestinian People's Party, you have the Palestinian National Initiative. Well, Hamas has gained the most influence because of their tactics. Do you know, Armstrong, in the Bible, Genesis chapter 6, where everything has gone wrong, there's an interesting passage that says, and violence filled the earth.
Right.
And the imaginations of men's heart were evil continually.
Mm-hmm.
The word violence in Hebrew, and Rabbi knows this, is Hamas.
Hamas.
That's not coincidental. You've got to understand that, and the language is important. This is not an Israeli-Palestinian conflict. It's an Israeli-Hamas conflict.
And even more than that, it's Hamas against the Western world, I would say.
And see, that's where I think we have to challenge ourselves too. When you see our best universities producing students who cannot differentiate like we're differentiating here, I think there's a deeper, because I think Catholic churches have been tagged lately for their views. There's a pastor in Finland now who's on trial for his views of marriage, which is just biblical views of marriage. You know, all of these kinds of things. I always ask the question, can you be moral without believing in God? And everyone's basically saying, yes, and we're going to show you how. Well, this is the end of that. When you actually say God is dead, which is what Nietzsche said in the 60s, and everyone's put it on Time magazine, well, this is what happens 50 years later. When people are amoral and their narrative is all that they need to justify themselves, well, they can do almost anything, which is what they were doing in Genesis
Well, here's
6.
what I think. I think you were going somewhere with the universities, and I think this is what's often lost with the universities and in this discussion. You know, you can have ambition and you can have goal, but I think what we don't focus on enough is incentive.
Okay, I like that.
What incentivizes the universities to keep these students? And there is no way for people with common sense like us, they already know where these kids are, what they believe. They've heard this through articles they've written and things that have been said. What incentivizes them? And oftentimes, that's money and power.
Sure.
So you need to ask yourself, where is the money? People like to say, oh, the Jews support all these institutions. Oh, the Jews are the greatest philanthropists. But listen, the Arabs are also. they're just as rich as the Jews. Nobody focuses on that. They like to focus on the Jews and have all the money. But that is a fallacy in and of itself. What is the incentive, Pastor, for this to continue, for someone that says, oh, well, we're not going to expel them, we believe in freedom of speech? Yes, until it comes at a price for you in your home, and all of a sudden, you decide, I've got to take a stand. Remember what they said. They came for the Jews, we said nothing. They came for the Catholics, they came for the gays. It's not until they come for you that what incentivizes you changes.
Right.
Yeah, Armstrong, you're absolutely right. Too many Americans watch the news, and they're so removed from what they're seeing on television, they falsely believe that it could never happen to them. And then when it does happen, all of a sudden it becomes an issue that warrants their time, their attention, their money. But universities are struggling, Armstrong. Christian universities are struggling because the issue of sexual identity, same-sex marriage, and all of these other things that are coming into play is really challenging Christian universities to determine how Christian they are. And what does that mean? What values do they subscribe to? And they're wanting to be open and welcoming, but they really are doing a bad job, like the church has done over the years, a bad job of navigating this tension between maintaining our religious convictions and distinction from the prescriptions of the culture. It's not easy, but they're wrestling through that right now. And if it's usually the threat of losing financial support that forces them to choose a side.
And that is a fact. That's what incentivizes them. There are churches that would teach the word of God, but all of a sudden, the big donors would say, well, I don't like that message. And if you don't change, you cannot say that homosexuality is a sin. You cannot preach against transgenderism in the pulpit, else I'm going to pull away my millions of dollars. So that's what incentivizes them. They not only adjust their message, but to eventually totally capitulate.
So what we're seeing is the shock, first of what happened on October 7th, and then this outpouring of the venomous anti-Semitism on campuses and elsewhere. And so I'm proud of many members of the Jewish community who have been large donors to many of these universities. And like you said, there's a problem because the Arabs can step right in with their money, but who have said, wait a minute, you know what, we have supported this institution for so long. We graduated from this institution, and now this is what's happening in terms of our own kids are feeling intimidated, and they aren't even feeling safe on campus. We're going to be holding back some of our money. And so I think that that's one of the major problems that we have right now is this distortion. There are professors in college campuses in California who gave students credit if they would go to a anti-Israel, pro-Hamas rally. There are professors who refuse to let their students study in Israel. And so they are taking these issues and these stands, which are just so offensive and so narrow-minded. You know, there is a choice that people have to make. Earlier this summer, I was in the UAE and Bahrain as a guest of the government there with a group of rabbis. And we saw there are those within the Muslim world, there are those within the Arab world who want to look forward to the future, who are willing to build bridges of tolerance and of understanding. And then there's those who want to take us back to the Middle Ages, such as Hamas. And it's a real battle for the soul of people. And getting back to what you said earlier, Armstrong, I just for the life of me cannot understand how intelligent, good thinking, good people would possibly want to take up that banner and that cause.
Well, let me say this before we go to break. I want to address that because I like the honesty of this discussion. You know, we talk about the young people and on college campuses, but if you talk to many adults, and if you dig deep enough, they are just as sympathetic to Hamas and the Palestinians are the young kids. And they hide behind this cloak. Well, I'm not going to say anything. I don't speak about it. But it's not just the young people. And you find it in the professorships where this continues to go on. And it's not until you have this conflict, this war, where it brings it to full force, where everyone stake their stake in the ground. And so what you're seeing now is what is being reflected. This is how people really feel. Okay? And no one wants to talk about it. I've talked to people that I've been close to for ages, and they watch me, they read what I say, and they pull me to the side, and they said, well, have you ever considered this? Blah, blah, blah. I said, you got to be kidding me. You cannot justify what happened on October the 7th. They said, well, they've been doing it to the Palestinians all along, and this is how they eventually responded. These are intelligent people. This is so rooted that people don't even want to talk about. It's easy to talk about the kids, but look at the roots where these kids come from, and you may find yourself shocked at what's going on, not only in America, but around the world. And you know what it is? It's purely unadulterated hatred of Jews. Their success, because it puts in the spotlight the failure of the leadership of the government in the Arab world. No one wants to talk about it. It's no different than what happened in the Holocaust and everywhere else throughout history. It's happening again, and that's why many Jews are scared to death. Because they believe it can happen again. And guess what? It can, and if it will, if we remain solid. And we'll be back. And welcome back to Your Voice, Your Future. Pastor, what about the intellectuals that are running the world and those that the Biden administration is fighting now, saying that the Biden administration is doing too much for Israel and they should show even more compassion towards not only Palestine, but Hamas?
You know, Armstrong, there's a sad reality here, and I'm sure that the Rabbi can bear witness to this. There's a wonderful passage in the Psalms, and it basically teaches the principle that you can't make peace with someone who has war in their heart.
Yes.
There are those in this world, in the Middle East especially, who are convinced that they will never accept Israel's right to exist. So even as we cease fire and try to normalize diplomatic talks, the reality is we can only experience seasons of ceasefire until we change that attitude, that mindset. And that's not as easy. We've seen changes with the relationship with Egypt. We've seen changes with the Jordanians, but when you have an Iranian-fueled violent terrorist group that is in power, that has to be dealt with decisively, Armstrong. So I don't know where this is going to end up, but it will require the normalization of diplomatic talks. It's going to require trade-offs. That's the reality.
I'd like to point out, if I may, the fact that two of them, the United States' closest allies now, are Germany and Japan. And that was accomplished when there was a victory. That was accomplished when Germany admitted it had been defeated and Japan admitted it had been defeated and said, we're not going to continue to fight. We're not going to continue this battle and this war. And that's what has to happen here with Hamas. Because
you heard what the German leader said just this week.
Please share.
You will be deported. This anti-Semitism is not going to be tolerated in Germany. There will be a price for that. It's very clear.
Yeah. But look what had to happen for that. I mean, Nazism was destroyed. And I remember reading a quote about that because the Lutheran Church comes from Germany, right? And I remember they said, we never thought the Germans would do to us. It was an advanced culture. Mm-hmm. But it was an amoral culture at the time. Wagner wasn't the culture of the gospel anymore. It wasn't that had been done away with. And so Hitler was a person who hated the true church in Germany and knuckled them under. But they had to expunge Nazism for it to be the kind of place now that can serve and can actually bear witness to your protection.
And so that's why this is a moment of moral clarity in terms of which direction people will go. Yes, Pastor, you wanted to say something? And
I'm concerned, Rabbi, as you refer to the history of Japan and its relationship with the U.S. and Germany, I pray that we don't have to have a Hiroshima or a Nagasaki.
As do I, absolutely.
To go into that kind of change in relationship and posture. So, I pray that we don't have to have that, degree
Well, let me clarify, if I may, Pastor. You know, the conflict that's going on right now with Israel and Hamas would be over in a moment if the Hamas would just release the hostages. And so they are holding the keys to that. And the suffering of Palestinians would end in a moment if they would but release the 240 to 250. There are, by the way, 30 to 40 children under the age of 18. They're children who are babies. There are 4-year-olds or 9-year-olds. I've seen some of the tape of the way in which they were tormenting the kids. They went in and they slaughtered people, and then they would have something to eat in their house. They would slaughter people in front of their children, and then afterwards kill the children. So they had seen this. It's just inconceivable, the level
and this
of
is
evil.
instructional. This is what they're being told to do.
Yeah. Well, let me ask you a question, Rabbi. If they allow these hostages to go, which that is my prayer, and that's what it should be, does it now open the Palestinians and Hamas to a very severe military action from the state of Israel because there's no restraint that's caused by these hostages? What do you say to that?
I would say two things. Number one, you know, the only Israelis in Gaza at this point are those that are being held captive. There are no Israeli settlements. There's no beef. Israel left Gaza in 2005. They left them greenhouses. They left them industries. They said, here it is. Go and make a prosperous country, as Singapore did, as Hong Kong did, and other places. But instead, they chose to elect Hamas, and as a result, in the last 10 or 13 years or so, there have been 4 different wars, that skirmishes. And so I think the reality is that Israel's going to have to, as it's trying to do, is to eliminate the leadership of Hamas. Unfortunately, there are innocent lives that will be lost along the way, as there have been in any conflict. By the way, you know, in the Syrian civil war, there were 500,000 Arabs who were killed in that civil war, and it's still going on. And yet we hear no objection about that. There have been Muslims who have been killed in China by the Uyghurs, the Uyghur group, and there's no outcry about that. It's only when it's a conflict between Israel, or between the Jewish people of Israel and Hamas and the Palestinians, that all of a sudden people care about the loss of Palestinian lives and the loss of Arab lives. But if they really, really cared, if they really were people of conscience, they would be out there protesting all of these other things as well.
But it's not even a fair definition to call the people in Gaza refugees, as you look at what refugees are, where it was just in Pakistan, Afghanistan, where they just expelled 1.7 million people out of the country. Look at Syria, look at Sudan. There are cases that are far worse. And why does Israel get all of this attention?
Right.
Why?
Because of what you just said before, because of the hatred of Jews.
Jews, that's exactly right.
Yeah.
Pastor?
And biblically speaking, Armstrong, you know, that is a biblical reality that's stated in the early text about this tension with Israel and the Arab community. I've made 11 trips to Israel. I was in Gaza. I was there in Beersheba when they were at war. You could hear the gunfire and whatnot from my hotel room. And I went in and I spoke to some of the Palestinians, and I will tell you, Armstrong, all right, they want the same things that the Israelis want. But there is fear and terror amongst them. All right. And of course, misinformation that's being circulated that furthers the agenda for this terrorist group that has taken over. You know, Jesus taught that evil loves a vacuum. And that's why when we don't speak up, when we don't unite around the higher values that we should all subscribe to, we create a vacuum, and evil will fill that vacuum, and we will be where we are today.
And on the counterpoint, as our Christian friends know, from the book of Genesis, it says, I will bless those nations that bless you. And
Genesis
so
12 and 15.
And that's one of the blessings that occurred. We were talking before about between the evangelical community and the Jewish people and the Jewish community is an appreciation of that commonality that we have, and hope that others will come to recognize that as well.
And I just think, you know, one of the things that I try to tell my people is that yes, obviously we preach the gospel, the good news of God and the love of God and Christ, that's our main message, but we have a preservative role too. God calls us to citizenship. He calls us to be preserving, salt and light, as Jesus says it, and people don't realize preserving work, you got to roll up your sleeves. You've got to take a stand. You've got to say no to this and yes to that. And we're beginning to see that this is a no that has to be said.
You know, I cannot thank everyone for joining us tonight. And I think what is often lost is that people forget we care just as much about the Palestinians as we do anybody else. But to savagely, unprovoked, attack someone like animals on October the 7th and not expect there to be consequences is insanity at its best. We got to find the best of in each other, but it's not going to be tomorrow. There will be a war, and innocent people are going to die. That's the unfortunate thing about it. We have to pray for one another and pray for peace. Good night, everyone, and thank you for joining us.